So to finish up with Pacifica, I'll leave plenty of time, I hope, at the end of the class for you to pick up the paper so that there's no messing up my alphabetical scheme. Pacifica. The Justice Stevens' opinion for the court stands as the source of the FCC's enforcement operation ever since. Tuck this little factoid away. Justice Stevens, when he wrote the opinion, attached as an appendix to the opinion the transcript of George Carlin's 7 Dirty Words monologue. That will become relevant as we look at the internet next week. The FCC really didn't do much in the way of enforcing the indecency regulation until Janet Jackson's breast appeared for a nanosecond at the halftime show at the Super Bowl, and CBS was fined for that wardrobe malfunction. That case is still in the courts. It still isn't final. But since Pacifica, and especially during the administration of George W. Bush, the FCC has more rigorously enforced its regulation, and in particular the time channeling part of it. That is, that indecent material, dirty words and nudity, can't be aired between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. After 10 p.m., they don't enforce the regulation at all. Fines are significantly higher than they used to be at the time of the Pacifica decision. Congress in 2006 raised the maximum fine to $325,000 per dirty word, and that was a tenfold increase in the previous maximum fine. And then the FCC began enforcing a new policy against the use of fleeting expletives. At the time of Pacifica, and for several years after that, in order to be actionable, in order for the FCC to fine a broadcaster, the expletives had to be deliberate and repetitive, the way Carlin's were. But after Bono, when he accepted a Golden Globe Award, said this is really, really fucking brilliant before millions of viewers, and Cher, when she got a Billboard Music Award, said I've also had critics for the last 40 years saying I was on my way out every year. Right, so fuck them. And Nicole Richie at the next Billboard Award asked the audience, why did they even call it A Simple Life? Have you ever tried to get cow shit out of a Prada purse? It's not so fucking simple. After those episodes, the FCC firmly started enforcing the fleeting expletive doctrine. And it was challenged, once it became official FCC policy, it was challenged by Fox television stations and others in the courts. The case presented 2 claims by the broadcasters. One, that the FCC simply did not have the authority to make a sudden policy shift like this. It was arbitrary and capricious as a matter of the administrative law that governs administrative agencies like the FCC and all of the others. Government agencies, in regulating various parts of our life, mostly business life, are not allowed to act arbitrarily or capriciously. And that was the allegation against the FCC's new policy, as well as an accompanying claim that the indecency policy violated the First Amendment. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with the broadcast industry that the fleeting expletives policy was arbitrary and capricious, and the government took the case to the Supreme Court, which in 2009 handed down a decision written by Justice Scalia saying that the agency had acted rationally, that it was not arbitrarily, not capriciously, but rationally. And Justice Scalia pussyfooted around what the actual words were. It was the F word and the S word. Readers of Supreme Court decision shouldn't be exposed, I suppose, to the real words. And interestingly, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote a concurring opinion agreeing that as a matter of administrative law, the court was right, but the underpinning of the whole indecency regulation was Red Lion, giving broadcast a reduced quality of First Amendment protection, and Pacifica itself that had upheld the indecency rule of the FCC. And Justice Thomas said that under the original meaning of the Constitution, the founders would never have allowed the government to operate in this way, and the 20th century conditions, or 21st century conditions now, can't alter the original meaning of the Constitution. And given the opportunity, Thomas said he didn't think Red Lion and Pacifica were still good law. Somewhat inconsistent with his original meaning philosophy, he said that the technological advances since Red Lion and Pacifica eviscerated the factual assumptions that underlay those decisions. The decision was 5-4 to uphold the FCC's doctrine as a matter of administrative law, and because the Second Circuit had not addressed the First Amendment question, it found that the FCC new policy was invalid as a matter of administrative law. It hasn't reached the constitutional question because it hadn't. The Supreme Court didn't either. So Scalia says there'll be time enough to consider that if it's properly raised later. And of course, it's properly raised in the very same case, because when the case was remanded to the Second Circuit to decide the constitutional question, the Second Circuit waded right in and decided that the FCC, the entire indecency policy of the FCC was constitutionally invalid. Not just the fleeting expletives twist on the regulation, but the entire indecency regulation violated the First Amendment. And I put a summary of the court's reasoning in the reader. The court doubted that Pacifica still made any sense. I mean, it depended on Red Lion's consideration of spectrum scarcity, and spectrum scarcity is scarcely a factor anymore given all of cable and satellite and whatnot. And cable is almost as pervasive as broadcast these days. At the time of the Second Circuit decision, 87% of American households had cable or satellite. So broadcast was sort of becoming irrelevant. The internet was omnipresent. There were the V chip, which had to be installed in every television set sold in the United States starting at the beginning of the 21st century, was available. If parents wanted to block out indecent speech, they had the technological means of doing so. But the Second Circuit focused on how inconsistent and vague the FCC's enforcement of the indecency policy had been. The Commission had announced that it deemed the words fuck and shit presumptively indecent, but then it had no objection to the airing of Saving Private Ryan on television, the Spielberg movie about the invasion of Normandy, which had hundreds, if not thousands, of fucks and shits in the script. And the court said, how can the FCC consistently enforce this indecency regulation? It really couldn't, and it was impermissibly vague. That is, a reasonable person, like a reasonable broadcaster, would have to guess whether a particular program would incur a major fine from the FCC because you really couldn't predict what they might do. Well, no big surprise. The government went back to the Supreme Court arguing that the spectrum scarcity was not a thing of the past, and there has to be some kind of a safe haven to protect American households from the infliction of indecent material at times when children might be in the audience. The case was argued in the Supreme Court on January 10th this year, and I thought, given that it was argued that early, that by now we might be able to discuss the decision and find out whether there is still an indecency policy that the FCC can enforce, and analyze its First Amendment analysis, see whether they've changed the rules as to broadcasters and no longer view broadcasters as second-class citizens for First Amendment purposes. But of course, the court hasn't got around to it yet. Maybe next week, but probably not until June. So we're in a position of having to guess what the court might do. How many of you, knowing what you know about the FCC's indecency policy, would like to see the court throw out the indecency policy on First Amendment grounds? And how many of you would like to see the court uphold it? Wait a second. You can't abstain here. Either you think it's a good policy. The justices can't say, oh, gee, I can't make up my mind. You can't either. Either you think it's a good policy and we need it, ought to have it, and whether you think it's constitutional or not is sort of by the way, or you think it's an abominable policy, it can't exist in this country consistent with the First Amendment, and the court ought to get rid of it. So let's try that again. How many of you think that the court should throw out the policy as unconstitutional? And how many of you think that they should uphold the policy as constitutional? One? Well, for those of you guys who favor ending the FCC policy, let me ask you this. How do you answer the questions that several of the justices posed during the oral argument? Our friend Solicitor General Donald Verrilli argued the case for the government again. By the way, the court calls him general because they call the Solicitor General general, and they call the Attorney General general when they appear in court, but they are not military officers. If they're arguing before the court, they call General Verrilli or General Holder, but they have nothing to do with the Army. Just in case some of you wonder when you look at the marks on your paper why I question that. Anyway, Donald Verrilli points out that the broadcasters, Fox leading the broadcaster contingent, did not make any contention in this round in the court that circumstances have changed since Red Lion or since Pacifica with regard to radio. Everybody's been saying, oh, well, this is all about television, but it's about broadcast radio and television. And that prompted Justice Alito to inquire, and I think it was a genuine quandary that he was wondering about, can we uphold the FCC's policy with regard to television? Well, with regard to radio, but strike it down with regard to television. Did I say that backwards? No. What he's thinking is we want to have the indecency regulation for television, but maybe it's not necessary for radio. And Verrilli said that that would be doable. And then Scalia asks, look, these are the public airwaves. Isn't the government entitled to insist on a modicum of decency, a small safe haven? And how do you answer that? You know, a quiet place where parents can send their kid into the next room during prime time and not risk having the kid exposed to indecent material on the television. Isn't government entitled to have that modicum of decency, that safe place for decency, right? Why does the government? Is it the government's role to step into parental supervision when the parents are not paying attention? That's certainly a legitimate question. Chief Justice Roberts followed that up, and it was sort of a Freudian slip. He says, all we are asking for, all the government is asking for, he says, is channels without the F word and the S word. Give us that safe haven. Shouldn't government give the people that safe haven? And maybe you got a good answer for that. Roberts said also, in questioning one of the lawyers for the broadcast industry, doesn't the proliferation of other outlets, you know, they keep emphasizing, well, we got all this cable, satellite radio, niche publications, all these things, you don't need government regulation anymore because there's a real marketplace of ideas out there. And Roberts said, well, doesn't the proliferation of other outlets cut against the broadcaster's argument? His idea, as I read between the lines, is the safe haven idea. Because there are so many places out there where kids can be exposed to indecent material, in life, in school, at work, and in all of the media except for this little safe haven the broadcast might be able to provide. Doesn't that cut against? What do you think, Ariel? But some of those family-friendly channels would also cover probably the music awards and things like that, right? Broadcast networks, primetime, watch the Grammys and so on. And Kennedy then asked the broadcast people, doesn't this mean that it's inevitable that the celebrities who come on, knowing, I mean, if you do away with the indecency policy, knowing that there's going to be no fine, are going to blurt out the most creative obscenities that they can think of? Isn't that inevitable? So even on family-friendly channels. And then Kennedy says, does this broadcaster's argument mean that indecency cannot be regulated at all? However you define it? Even if the indecent material is, going back to the former FCC policy, deliberate and repetitive? Are we throwing the whole thing out? Or is there some constitutional leeway for the government to regulate indecency? The statute, of course, charges the FCC with enforcing the rules against obscenity. That's not involved here. Indecency and profanity. And you see I put in the reader the FCC's interpretation of how it looks at the enforcement under that statute. They say, well, it's context-based. You know, even the F word and the S word might, as in the Private Ryan case, be acceptable, not indecent. And you may think it's a reasonable policy, or you may think it's silly for the government to be involved in this effort at all. How do you think the court will come out? Now that you are intimately familiar with this court and each justice, how do you think the court is likely to vote here? Anybody have a guess? Let me forewarn you that it appears that Sonia Sotomayor is not participating in the case. As far as I can tell, I can't figure out why she's not, but it looks like it's only an 8-justice court. Well, you can be educated to some extent by the previous decision in this very case, which upheld the FCC's fleeting expletives policy, not on constitutional ground, admittedly, but that was Scalia, who wrote the opinion, joined by Alito and Roberts in that opinion. Then what to do about Thomas is really, is he going to stick to his guns and say that Red Lion was wrong, Pacific is wrong, therefore no indecency policy is allowed? That would be quite surprising. Kennedy, our swing guy, concurred in the fleeting expletives. It was a separate opinion. But, as you know, he's been pretty good on First Amendment cases generally, and he wrote a couple of really daring sex-related First Amendment decisions. The Playboy Enterprises case, which we'll talk about when we get to cable, and he wrote the decision in the virtual child pornography case a few years ago, in which the court threw out the statute that prohibited images of children, of what, quote, appear to be children doing sexual things, which was really a tough one for the court. He wrote that opinion. So it's hard to predict him. Kagan said some nice things about the safe haven notion during the argument. Ginsburg and Breyer dissented in the fleeting expletives case. There's a chance that the court could split evenly in the indecency case, 4-4. And then what happens? The decision of the Court of Appeals stands by an evenly divided court. The court can't upset it. The Second Circuit decision stands. That doesn't mean that the court couldn't take up the issue in some later case. Well, the doctrine is that the indecency regulation applies only to over-the-air carriers. But that's not limited to just the big networks. Anybody who has a broadcast license, whether it's radio or television, over the air, using the public airwaves, is governed by this regulation. That means cable is not. So the kids flipping the channel at home, they don't have a clue whether they're watching a channel that is governed by the indecency regulation or one that's not. All comes out of the same box. You know? Yeah, in my view, yes, but the idea that parents will know that there's at least one place that is safe for their children seems to have great appeal to at least 3 justices, if not 4, maybe 5, who could recoil at the idea of these vulgarities being aimed at America's children. Say, oh, this is not the kind of society that I want to bless. Anyway, to bring us closer up to date about regulation of broadcast, last week the Ninth Circuit decided this Minority Television Project case, which involves the statute, not an FCC rule, a statute that prohibits public broadcasting stations, KQED here, KALW and so on, that prohibits them from running what they define as advertisements, and the statute defines advertisements as commercials to promote products or services of for-profit advertisers, you know, toothpaste, cars, the usual stuff. However, ads that nonprofit businesses, Planned Parenthood, for example, the Red Cross, that nonprofits want to put on the air are not banned by this law. So it's commercials for commercial purposes. Then the second category banned by the statute are messages, quote, to express the views of any person with regard to any matter of public importance or interest. Public